And as you can see, with the amount of dust still on the surface from this relic that was recently unearthed in an archaeological dig, that the specimen is still housed in its original egg. With the egg opened up, you can see that this poor specimen never quite was able to achieve full maturity and was able to sprout its legs from its egg casing, forever to spend eternity in this format. However, thanks to recent developments in technology, we now have the missing sections of DNA to input back into the specimen over here, giving it life and having it able to live outside of its egg casing.
Yeah, but your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could that they didn't stop to think if they should.
Hey everyone, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com, and I'm welcoming you all today to another episode of Aurora Park. For this episode, we have another M46 Patton. However, unlike the previous episode where those were Atlantis reissues, this one here is a legit original Aurora M46 Patton kit. This model here was built for my own personal collection. It's not for sale and or purchase. However, like I often mention in these build videos, I frequently take on commission build projects for models ranging between 1/35th scale and 1/6 scale. Although this model here is outside that normal purview, if anyone is interested in having a price code for me to work on a model like this, be sure to email me through the email address listed below, which is info@eastcoastarmory.com. Obviously, this model went through an extensive redetailing and upgrade process in order to bring it up to the condition that we have here. So we'll be going over all these modifications in this video. In addition to that, we're going to be giving this model a proper unboxing where you get to see what the original contents of this kit looked like when the project was first started. So stay tuned because there's going to be a ton of info coming right at you. To start this model off, let's go ahead and take a quick walk around this model. And this here is the M46 Patton medium tank. The M46 was probably the best medium tank designed by the United States during the World War II era. Problem was that this vehicle entered service in 1949, so it definitely missed World War II by a few years. However, the M46 Genesis is really with the M26 Pershing. The M26 obviously was designed during World War II and entered service at the tail end. As good of a design as the M26 was, after it was entered into service and was fielded, some shortcomings with the design were definitely noticed, most of which were merely automotive. The vehicle was underpowered, although it was powered by a Ford GAF V8 gasoline engine. That engine was basically the same GAA found on the Sherman, but with more horsepower. Even with the more horsepower, it wasn't enough to propel a vehicle with the weight of the M26, so the vehicle was underpowered. In addition to that, the M26's transmission was also deemed to be a weak point. Both of these shortcomings were going to be addressed with this new design. Instead of the GAF, the engine was replaced by a Continental V12 engine, which was still gasoline powered, but it was air cooled and had much more horsepower compared to its water cooled counterpart. In addition to the new engine, a new transmission was also developed, which was going to be an improvement again from the original one from the Pershing. By changing out these two factors, this required an extensive modification to the rear portion of the Pershing. This completely had to redesign the rear engine and grillwork area, and the entire rear plate area was redesigned as well. The Pershing's characteristic droop downward sprocket was removed with a sprocket that was now in line with the top return rollers, and because of this, a trailing idler was also designed, which was a device that was going to give constant tension to the track and would prevent it from throwing if the tank was on rough terrain, specifically making a turn. Because of the engine's air-cooled nature, the entire system needs to have been revised, and this gave way to the iconic barbecue slat grill work, which is present on this pattern of vehicle, and also the other two vehicles that followed afterwards, namely the M47 and the original M48. The exhaust manifolds were redirected to the sides on these two iconic large muffler type exhaust manifolds, which had some heat shields on them to protect any crew members or any other type of people from getting burned if they accidentally make contact with the searing hot exhaust. On the rear portion, where the exhaust manifold would have been originally for the Pershing, there's now a telephone communication box as well as some access hatches to get to the transmission that's now located right behind the rear wall. Outside of these automotive changes, the remainder of the vehicle was pretty much on par with the M46A1 Pershing, both with the design of the main armament, secondary armament, and basically the remainder of the tank. The M46 got its designation because of the automotive changes and also received a new moniker in honor of George S. Patton, who sadly passed away around the time in the post-war years. The M46, really its main claim to fame was in the Korean War, where it was brought over to deal with the T-34 and the other Soviet tank threats, where, along with the Pershing and the M4A38, the vehicles performed very well and were proven to be the superior vehicle in the engagements with the Soviet armor. The Korean War, probably one of its more interesting aspects was at a certain time and place, there was an order given out to paint the tanks to look like tigers. This was done in order to boost morale, and well as also in a way to put fear in Chinese soldiers because of their superstitious nature. If that happened or not, that's to be debated. However, it is true that it did boost morale, and it gave us a very interesting period in U.S. armor history. After the Korean War, the vehicle was relegated to secondary service, although they were still fairly new. About 1,100 and change were produced in all, but by this point in time, armor development had already eclipsed the M46 Patton's design, and there were now new vehicles that are already in development and were going to come onto the scene that were going to be superior to the M46's capabilities. Of course, though, this would be another topic for another video for another day. Before we continue with the video, let's go ahead and take a step back to when this model was first started to get a good idea on what the base starter kit supplied me with. And here's the model at the start of the build. For the base starter kit, we will be utilizing this original 1970s release of the Aurora M46 Patton tank. And obviously, as you can tell from the muck on the table over here, as well as also on the box, that this model here has been sitting for a very long time. So it's going to be really cool getting to this one and getting it built. And I am personally really excited to dig into it. As for the original model here, if anyone is a fan of the channel, first, thank you for that. But secondly, recently I completed an Atlantis reissue of the 148 scale M46 Patton tank. That kit is a reissue and re-release of this kit that we have here that was from the company Aurora. Aurora is one of the OGs in the plastic modeling game and were one of the first outfits to ever release injection molded plastic kits back in the way back of the early or mid 1950s. The M46 Patton here was one of the very first kits that they actually released. What was unique about the Aurora kits was that they were all in a standardized scale, being 148. In fact, I'd argue they were one of the first companies to make tank kits in 148 scale. And then in the 1970s and the 1960s, the Japanese started to follow suit with their own releases in the same scale, with companies like Bandai as well as even Tamiya, but that's more or less a topic for another video. Back to the Aurora kits, Aurora stuck with the 148 scale for all of their military vehicle releases, and they released quite a wide range of kits for the era. The M46 was definitely one of the first, and in case you're watching this and you're looking at it and scratching your head saying, John, you must have some weird typo going on because you keep saying M46, but that is clearly not an M46. You don't know anything about tanks, and I do because I play World of Tanks. So rest assured, no, the kit is definitely an M46 Patton. That's just a quirk of the box art. You see, this here is the second, or I should say the third generation of Aurora box arts for the M46. The original one looked like the box art that you could see on the screen right now, and that one was the original release of the kit. That box art was illustrated by a certain illustrator. However, in the 1950s and specifically in the 1960s time frame, Aurora decided to change up the box arts and they hired this other illustrator. This illustrator, who personally is one of my favorite model box illustrators of all time, went ahead and did all of the Aurora box arts for their Monster series as well as also for their military vehicles. And this one here is one of those box arts. The box art is absolutely gorgeous. His illustrations just are top-notch. They are excellently detailed, but also you can see that they are hand-painted. One big caveat is, though, on the Patton box specifically, It's the wrong type of Patton. This is an M48A1, while the inner contents are for an M46. Clearly, something like this would not fly very well today, but, you know, we're talking about in the 1960s time frame, and, you know, it was a different era back then. Having said that, I always did love this box art, so it was really good when finally someone started making kits of the M48A1, but that's a topic for another video. So back to this box art that we have here. This, like I touched upon before, is the 3rd generation box. The 2nd generation box is the exact same box art, but it is in a rectangular format, as the Aurora kits of the time were really thin and had a rectangular type setup to them. Well, in the 1970s time frame, they decided to revise their kits once again, specifically their military vehicles. Rather than the thin, elongated square boxes, or rectangle boxes, I should say, they went ahead and changed it to this cube format here. And the reason why they did that was because they added a new feature on their military vehicle kits that weren't found on the older generation models, and that feature would have made stuffing that piece into those stretched out boxes to be utterly impossible. As for what that accessory is, well, unfortunately he doesn't have that component anymore, but I have another Aurora Patton over here that does. And that accessory was a vacuum formed floor base. This was a display base that was to be used as a diorama base, where out of the box you have not just the model tank in question, but you also have a nice little diorama display to display the model on. And this was the type of stuff that Aurora was doing at this time that made them pretty unique. They also came out with a few other gimmicks, like this thing where they put a telescope inside the tank and you can look through it, and a bunch of other wacky stuff. But, you know, Aurora was really creative and stuff like that. So back to this example over here. This over here, Aurora started to release kits in this format, and I want to say the 1974 time frame. I'm a little hazy on the subject, but if I'm not mistaken, I believe it was 74 when they produced kits in this format. Aurora would continue to produce plastic model kits. They wouldn't really tool up anything new. They would just, you know, stay the course and keep on releasing the kits that they already developed up until the late 1970s time frame, which at that point, I believe they sold all of their assets to Monogram, and the company was no longer in existence. Monogram kept some of the tooling for the Aurora kits alive in one guise or another, but they were never generally releasing their kits in the old format ever again. Fast forward to 2019, a new company was founded by Atlantis showed up, and they started re-releasing all of the older tooling kits, many of which from Aurora. They were able to obtain the licenses and also the tooling for many of their kits, and they've been re-releasing a lot of them for the last number of years. And I have done a few videos on the Atlantis re-release, and I recommend checking them out, specifically if you're into old vintage kits like, well, yours truly. Also, as a quick shout out, if you really want to know more about the Aurora Plastic Model Company, I strongly recommend checking out the video on the subject from the channel Max's Models. He goes into far more depth about the Aurora Plastic Model Company than I can in this video. In addition to that, he also does some pretty good description of many of the other older vintage model kit companies that have been around in the past, specifically during the era that we're talking about here. So, as a quick plug, I just want to mention that channel because, again, his content is pretty good. So back to this model over here. For me personally, one of my favorite plastic model companies are Aurora. And the reason for that is because when I was much younger, Aurora kits had this mystique to them because of their elusiveness and also because of their costs. You see, like I stated before, when Monogram purchased the rights to all of the Aurora company, Aurora itself was gone, and so were most of their releases. Afterwards, once they dried up on the marketplace, their kits started becoming insanely collectible, and with collectability goes up in price. All throughout the 90s and into the 2000s time frame, these kits here were reaching levels of cost that were just astronomical, where I seen just the empty boxes sell for, you know, about $150 alone. This was, you know, going on back then. If you had a mint in-box version, you were looking at least a $300 or $400 model kit. I know it sounds crazy, specifically to many of the younger builders out there, because these kits aren't exactly that well detailed, but you know, it just shows you just how much collectability is in a marketplace. In recent years, the prices have been coming down because sadly, most of the people who found these kits to be very collectible are more elderly now and are beginning to pass away. But the prices of these kits at one time were at levels that were just unfathomable. So rewinding our clocks back to the early 2000s, this finally allowed me to acquire my first Aurora model kits by finding them on eBay. That was another problem. You weren't exactly able to track these kits down, you know, in the older days. You were going to find them maybe in a model show, maybe a flea market, if that. So tracking one down was not that easy. But with the internet, this did change things quite a bit. And even on eBay, these kits would still sell for a pretty penny. So fast forward to 2002 or so, I was able to find an eBay auction where the guy had basically a collection liquidation and he had a ton of these Auroras that he was just getting rid of. These models were far from mint condition, as one can clearly see, and the kits themselves were not either they were either fully assembled, or they were missing pieces, or they were just empty boxes. And I was able to obtain the entire set for the price that was less than for one kit. So I made out very, very well on that acquisition. The models all came in. I built a few of them, the ones that were pretty much fully assembled. I just finished off, painted them, put them in my collection. That's where they remained. And the remainder of the unbuilt stash just stayed there collecting dust in my shop in the stash, which you probably saw in one of the other videos where I showed the stash, you know, very briefly. Well, fast forward to last year, I was able to purchase one of, or I should say a pair of the Atlantis M46 Patton kits to build one for myself and to build another one for a customer. Well, after doing that model, since I have all these Auroras on hand, screw it, I might as well go ahead and start building them up. And I'm going to start with this one over here. So, starting with the box art, obviously I touched upon this before, the box art is of an M48A1, it's a gorgeous box art as I touched upon before. Korean War Patton tank, okay, that's true for the M46, not so much for the M48, but you know, we can't hold it against them. This is the Aurora logo over here from the 1970s time frame. They had this giant A with, you know, the name in the middle. On the side here, we still have some bad fraud advertising where it is a M48 Patton, a crudely drawn one, which is funny considering the excellent one here on the cover. The one here looks like something I would have drawn when I was about 11, but, you know, it is what you see. Same exact graphic on all four sections, and that's basically all there is to the box art. So cracking the model open will reveal the kit contents. If anyone watched the other Atlantis M46 video, I used this particular model over here to compare and contrast the new tooling with the older one. And although the new Atlantis one is a rebox, or I should say a reissue of this kit here, Atlantis did make some changes to it for one reason or another. However, this here is the real McCoy. So starting with the upper hull, here you get to see the grill work. And as I touched upon before, the detail fidelity on the model here is going to be very, very simple and basic compared to what we expect on modern kits of the period. So if anyone wanted to know what kits looked like back in the 1950s time frame, this was the type of tooling you were going to find. And for the period, mind you, we're talking about the 50s now, this here was considered to be cutting edge detail. And by the most part, the detailing is all there. You can see that the engine grill is there, all of the hinge work is present, and so are the storage bins. Of course, the exhaust manifolds are a separate piece that get glued on, which is also a nice little bit of detailing. And the bins do have their hinging, vents, and also their latch details present in place. Again, very simple, but for the scale, it actually works pretty well, I find. Some other detailing would include the front toe shackles, the bow MG, and even the headlight mounts. And the fenders do have their rigidity boss molded on. The gas caps are present, albeit in a simplistic form, but you know, the point still stands. And the side portion here has the side skirts integrally molded on. This is something that was also carried over, of course, on the Atlantis, but the Atlantis went ahead and made some extra alterations to it to give it some better detailing. Like they gave it the rigidity braces that are found on the tin work, and they also gave it some side detailing here for the fenders. But this is what the original Aurora tooling did look like. Carry on takes us to the lower hull plate here, and it's just a flat plate. The M46 does have some intricate side sections over here where the geometry has an angle to it, but this kit here, that type of detailing is absent. However, we do have some nice front luscious plate detailing right over here, and it does have the nice curvature which would be found in this pattern of vehicle. Not to mention the rear plate also has some geometry going on here, which does give you the look and feel of the M46 by and large. Here we have one of the side plates. As you can see, the hull is a multi-part assembly. And if I can find the other side plate, here it is. All of the torsion bars are integrally molded on, as well as the torsion bar detailing, which would include the shock absorbers. Interestingly enough, they pulled a trick that Hen Long does on the remainder of the suspension swing arms, where they also added extra shock absorbers for one reason or another. That's obviously not the case on the M46, but it is on the Hen Long, so, you know, let that marinate. The roll wheel count is correct, as are the top return rollers, as even with the trailing idler, the sprocket, and the front idler. So once the suspension is fully assembled, you do have the appropriate wheels which would be found on the real vehicle. Here you can see a tangled up thing of runners. Oh, by the way, this is the original plastic that these things were molded in back in the 70s and in the 50s. Here we have the rear plate. And if anyone's ever built an M46 Patton before, these details here should all come out at you. From the telephone box, to the first aid kit, to the rear transmission access panels, all that detailing is present. So are the rear taillights, which are integrally molded into these two sections over here. Next runner takes us to the lift rings, which on this model here are actual rings. This is something that I always like to modify on my builds, and I'll touch upon that as the video goes on, but this is what the original kit did supply you with. The next component we have here is the main cupola hatch, or I believe that's the hatch, because there is a nice moat of flash around it, which, by the way, it's always funny when I watch other YouTubers that do, you know, model reviews, and when they do like a modern kit and they complain about the flash and it's like a little thing, if that, around it, and they're like, well, the piece is nicely detailed, but there's flash. Like, yeah, that ain't flash. That's flash, okay? And by the way, the flash is literally nothing. It is so thin. It's like paper thin here, and it just carves away with an X-Acto in less than, 10 seconds. So bear that for what you will. However, this is, again, something that is more indicative of these older tooling kits. And the hatch itself, it's a standard USGI lay pattern commander's cupola hatch. It does have a little bit of handle detailing integrally molded in, which is a nice touch for the period. Interior-wise, there's nothing there, but the hatch was able to be fully functional. The next component that really does show that this model here was a product of its era were the sprockets. And here go a sample of the two sprockets. It's the same piece that basically just gets held together by a center spindle, which is also in this lump of parts over here, and that facilitates the sprocket detailing. Now, to modern modelers out there, they're going to look at this and say, ugh, they're going to put poo all over. It's not the wrong shape. It doesn't have the mud slits. It's pretty, wide to be a sprocket. Well, yeah, all that's true. However, keep in mind, 1954, this was actually ahead of its time, considering that the other kits of the period, like from Revell, for instance, or Renwall, they just had a sphere with a drawing of a sprocket on it. So the fact that this actually has real sprocket teeth and that they actually engage on the sprocket tooth sections on the track was definitely something that showed just how cutting edge these kits were at the time. And it also shows just how advanced the tank modeling game has gotten in the last 50 some odd years. But, you know, you want to know where things started, you're looking at it right here. This mostly depleted runner has, I believe, what's a headlight. Hard to tell. Here we have some hatches. And these are the bow hatches, and they look the part of the bow hatches found on the M26 and M46 family of vehicles. They even have nice little periscope detailing integrally molded on. And we have another hatch, another cupola hatch. So, like I stated before, when I bought this lot, it was just basically a jumble of runners. So, I may have some duplicates in here, and we'll see how that pans out. But this is what the hatch looks like without the flash present. Another runner here with an arm from a commander, because that did supply you with a figure, I believe. And also another one of those hatches. Okay, depleted runner, depleted runner. This runner here has 2 of the hubcaps present. Of course, you would need these to secure the wheels onto the side sections. And that's how it was done. You had the wheels, which were this little section over here. Which, by the way, here's the wheel. It has the fastener details integrally molded on, and again, for 1/48 scale, it's actually pretty decent. And this would be held in place with the end cap over here, which is the hubcap, and once the hubcap's glued on, it allows the wheel to rotate freely, but it prevents it from falling out. As like with many of the kits from the era, this one here did have some playability in mind. And I'm pretty sure a few older gentlemen are going to chime in saying, I used to play with them all the time, before putting a firecracker in it, because, you know, that's what kids did. This here is the M2HB. It's on its pedestal base and has a very vague looking cradle present. You know, it does the job for what it is. I'm not going to be using it on this build because I'll be touching upon that, spoiler alert, as the video goes on, but there's the M2. Here go the idlers. Again, same type of design as with the hubs, where they are held in place with the hubcaps. And the hubcaps themselves, like I may have touched upon before, are nicely detailed for what they are. They have the correct geometry to it. They have the little dome on the surface, and they have what appears to be the little provisions for the fasteners, which are just amorphous nubs, but hey, you know, it is detailing nonetheless. As for the rollers, they do not have any other detailing on them whatsoever, because the hubcap basically fulfills all of this real estate on this area over here. And just like with the main row wheels, the return rollers are fully functional. More rollers, more rings with more hubcaps. So I think I should have enough hubcaps for the job at hand. This here are one of the exhaust manifolds. Of course, the M46 is iconic for having those large car muffler type exhaust mounted on either fender. And on the kit, there is no heat shield that is present, so the mufflers are just exposed for everyone to see. As for the muffler itself, again, you know, decent rendering for the scale and the era. And these will be used on this build, albeit with a few tweaks to it. This is an exhaust manifold from a Centurion, so obviously this is not relevant for this video. It's a runner rubber. I think this is for the 8-inch howitzer. Those are the tires. Not this kit. Empty runner, some sprockets, another rear plate. Okay, so this takes us to the turret. The turret is a multi-piece assembly, as you can clearly see. We have here a bottom bucket type setup. The 2 turret halves, which get glued together to form the basic shape, and then the turret roof, which just tops it off like that. As you can see, it has the overall look, shape, and feel of the M46 turret. We do have the shell ejection port, we have the provisions for some spare track, we have the cupola, the loader's hatch, and also the point here for the rear 50 cal pintle mount. The mantlet would go in this section over here, and it appears I am missing the mantlet and the main tube. I believe that's in another box, but we have the inner rotor. Also found on the interior portion here are a set of seats, because the kit has functional bow hatches, and you can actually put 2 crewmen in this section over here if desired. We have a pretty badly eroded set of decals for a Centurion. Those are definitely not going to be salvaged. Same thing with the Stalin. And here's another decal sheet for an old school Aurora Stalin. We got here a razor blade. Yeah, that's definitely not something that came with the kit. Even though in the 60s there were wacky stuff that were supplied. In the 70s there were wacky stuff supplied with model kits. This would fit in, but this was not part of the Aurora experience. And that's it for what's in this box over here. Let me go ahead and see if the remainder of the missing parts are in the other Patton box. Be right back. Okay, so I just checked the other box. I am missing some parts, namely the mantlet, the barrel, and also the exhaust manifold T-fitting. I believe I do have these parts in another box in the shop, so I'm going to be doing some digging, but there's no point getting that on camera. The one part that I was not able to track down, and it's not something that I could easily make a mold of and cast replacements for, are the Caterpillar tracks. And that's why this kit here stayed in this dormant state for over 2 decades. Well, again, thanks to Atlantis for popping up. They obviously, made a reproduction of this kit over here, and they have the correct Aurora track. So I went ahead and reached out to them via their email address, and they are really helpful people and hooked me up with a set of their replacement tracks. These tracks here are current issue from the Atlantis kit, and because of that are brand new tooling. The material is brand new. It's not like the older rubber that's found on the older kits, which, by the way, if I compare it with the older track here, you can see just how stiff the older track was in comparison to the Atlantis one, which is actually something that I personally appreciate because it just makes handling them much easier. And also, if you're going to play with the thing, it rolls a hell of a lot easier with the new tracks compared with the older ones. And I asked a few people out there who built these kits back in the day, and the consensus was, yeah, the tracks were always a bit stiff on them, even, back in the day. So it's not like the tracks stiffened up over time. So the newer tracks are actually a huge improvement over the original ones. So I was able to get these tracks from Atlantis. I paid like $5 or something for them shipped. And again, I just want to give a special shout out to Atlantis for helping me out with this build over here. So now that you saw all of the old school parts here, the next thing to mention is what else I'm going to be doing to this model. And as one can clearly see, the Aurora kits are neat for what they are. However, detailing wise, they're a bit on the soft end. Well, if anyone watched the other Atlantis M46 video that I've done, and even the JS3 video, you'll know that I went ahead and came up with some solutions to improve the original Aurora or Atlantis tooling. And I have that right here. This set here is specifically designed for the Aurora set and is slightly different from the Atlantis one. However, an Atlantis hop-up set is also on the EastCoastArmory.com Shapeways store. So here goes the sprue right here, and this contains a number of components to take the old Aurora tooling and kick it up to levels that are much more detailed. So the biggest thing that's on here are the heat shields. Like I touched upon before, the kit's exhausts do not have their heat shields present. The heat shield detailing is right here, and of course this entire set here is HD 3D printed. So these components are simply designed to snip off the sprue and get mounted on top of the kit exhaust manifolds, giving you the appropriate heat shield detailing that would be required. In addition to that, we have things like the headlight brush guards, the siren brush guard, the 50 cal storage equipment, the 50 cal travel lock, the 50 cal storage pintle, the actual pintle mount itself, replacement periscopes, and also the detailing for the vane sight, periscope guard, and the front mounted 50 cal pintle mount. On top of that, you'll also see on this set the production versions of the MP65 antenna bases. This was something that I touched upon in the other video where I had to scratch build them out of sections of sprue. However, since I made that video and released that set, I went ahead and revised it, actually designing in CAD the MP65s, and this would be the appropriate antenna base for a vehicle from the 1950s time frame. There's 2 of them supplied and are designed to give you not just the antenna detailing, but also the antenna well detailing, which is absent on the kit. Another bit of detailing that I added is the travel lock. This is completely absent on the stock kit, and so this piece here is going to be a nice addition that's going to give that added missing detailing. The one thing that differentiates this set here compared to the Atlantis counterpart is that the Atlantis counterpart also has some details for the grill work, because on the Atlantis kit, the grill sections that are in these areas over here are actually missing for one reason or another, and it's just a flat section of plate. Well, with the ECA piece, you get this detailing here on the model, and it fleshes out the back section, giving you the absent detailing, and it just completes the look of the M46 engine deck. Obviously, this one here doesn't need that because, well, it has the original grill work integrally molded on. So that's why those sections are absent. Also, what's not on the sprue right now is the tool rack, which is an iconic bit of detailing for the M46, but it's running around loose here in the bag. And there it is, right over there. I have to be really careful with this thing because it's really tiny, really fragile, and also very detailed. Once this gets installed to the model, it's really going to give so much extra detailing to the front section, as what was mentioned in the Atlantis rebuild, or the Atlantis upgrade video that I did a little while ago. And here's the model now ready for painting. Obviously, it has underwent quite a transformation compared to the original condition that we saw this model in towards the beginning portion of the video. So let's go ahead and, well, dive in at this point now, because obviously once it's painted, a lot of the little nuances and extra detail add-ons kind of just get absorbed by the paint job. So let's go ahead and quickly go over that. So starting with this large pile of wheels that we have here, believe it or not, the M46 has a deceivingly large number of road wheel components. And this isn't just true for the M46, but is also true for the M26 Pershing family, all the way up until the M60. These American tanks have a ton of road wheels on them, and more importantly, a lot of rubber tires that need to be painted. This, again, is something that seems a bit deceiving because you see the Patton family and it looks fairly simple and straightforward, but it looks a bit misleading because there are a lot of rubber tire surfaces found on all the various components found on this pattern of vehicle. The components you see here are just for the main road wheels and are not including the components for the sprockets, the trailing idler, and also the return rollers. Those are also going to add considerably to the part count, but there's no point referencing them right now on the table because I have all those components mentioned. The reason why I have the pile of wheels here is because on this example, as it turns out, I am missing quite a number of the main road wheels. At some point in time, we all saw the condition that this box was in. Obviously, they must have fallen off at some point to Lost Partia, and obviously, trying to find them now is going to be pretty much impossible. So, I just went ahead and did the next best thing. I took I took 2 of the original road wheels and just simply made a mold of them, so I was able to cast up fresh replacements that you can see right here on the table. The cast resin replacements are an exact copy of the original ones, and once fitted in place, it is definitely going to blend in without batting an eye. Although at this point here in the model's construction, it definitely has a Franken look to it, which is something that I always personally found really cool, specifically when you're building and upgrading a model, much along the lines as I'm doing right now. Also on the table, you can see I have a small little length of spare track. This was another bit of original detailing missing from the model. Fortunately, I had another one of these Aurora Pattons on hand that acted as a donor for me to make the mold to cast this copy over here. I was on the fence on whether or not to just simply scratch build a brand new track rack that gets fitted to the side, or to just, make a duplicate of the original one. The original track rack is not exactly that accurate in that the track pattern itself is very simplified from the real tracks found on this pattern of vehicle. However, I just went with the kit one for pragmatic reasons. I do have a time schedule that I'm working on, so trying to design a new piece really wasn't something that appealed to me all that much. And the second reason, this is actually the more important reason, is that it's for continuity. Because the tracks are going to be the original Aurora kit ones, just to keep everything in the same continuity. For the spare track rack here, I'm just going to repurpose the original one, and if it worked good originally, it should do the job just fine on this upgraded counterpart. And that's basically it for the running gear components. Let's now go into the main portion right here of the build, and you can see it's already starting to pop off with some of the details that I mentioned. So let's go ahead and go over that in more depth. So starting with the exhaust manifold, you can see that right now the exhaust heat shields are not permanently glued on in place. These are going to be affixed after the model is fully painted and weathered. This is just done so that I could thoroughly paint and weather these components here, and then just mount these units in place, much along the lines as I've touched upon in the 1/35 scale Patton based builds, and also on my other Atlantis / Aurora retool 148 models that, again, these parts do come from. As for the exhaust manifolds themselves, they are the kit originals, and I just drilled them out to give extra detailing to the parts over here. On the inside portion, one thing I want to mention is that with the way the kit goes together, you are going to have these gaping sections in these two areas right above the final drives, and this is something I just plugged up with a little bit of 2-part epoxy. I simply just rolled some together and insert into these two areas, sculpting them in, thus plugging this area up. This is not something that needs to be done, but it's just something that I personally like to do on my builds. On the final drives, there is a small little gap found in these two sections where everything intersects, and these were just simply covered up with a little bit of red putty that you can see here. Once everything's sanded flush, it blends this whole area in together. On a similar note, I also ran into a decent seam right over here where the rear wall makes contact with the lower portion. This is something that, again, is just a trademark found on these older tooling Aurora kits, and the Atlantis ones were no exception. Which goes to show you just how good of a re-release the Atlantis one actually is. On the front portion over here, you can see the cast texturing that has been added to the front armor area. This is something that I mentioned on the other video, but it was done basically with the exact same techniques as I mentioned before for the exact same reasons. So with the cast texturing added, you can really see how much it improves the stock model, lending itself for more greater accuracy. On this section, you can see the 148 scale ECA tool rack fitted in place, which obviously gives a huge heap and load of extra detail fidelity to this area over here. We also have the brush guards, which again add a very nice bit of extra detailing, which really spices up the model. For the headlights, these are new cast resin replacements. The original ones were long missing, and so what I did was, again, I took 2 of the spare Aurora headlights that I had from the other build and just simply made a direct copy of them with my mold. Casted 2 fresh units, and they just dropped directly into place as they would have originally on this model. I was thinking about making them as a 3D printed part, but for some reason I was having some problems with the part thicknesses with my printer, so for this one example over here, I just went around it and went with the resin counterpart. As for the M1919, this is the kit original unit. I just cleaned it up, drilled out the barrel section, and mounted it in place. On the front area, you can see the other tin work mods that I added, namely the rigidity lumps that are pressed into these sections over here. These are absent on the stock Aurora model, and these here were fabricated out of some thin strips of half-round stock from Plastruct. They were just cut, trimmed to shape, and then secured to the appropriate locations. Another thing that I did was I added the cut line right over here where the front muff flap makes contact with the remainder of the tin work. This again adds some extra detail fidelity, and it's missing on the stock kit. And I also went ahead and added the fender supports that are found on the front and also on the rear. Again, an iconic bit of detailing found on the Patton, the M26 to the M47 Patton family vehicles, and this was fabricated out of just some lengths of thin floor wire that were bent, flattened in the appropriate locations, and then just secured in place. Obviously, once it's all detailed, it's really going to, or once it's all painted, I should say, it's going to give some very nice detailing to the section as a whole. Along the tin work, you also see the dividers that I fabricated out of sections of really thin Plastruct strip. Again, it's another way to improve this model further. And on the bin lids, you can see I went ahead and fabricated the little grab handles, which are just pieces of floor wire that are bent to shape and then added to new holes that were drilled into these sections over here. Moving upward, you can see the bow hatches. The bow hatches, I've always been hit and miss on these Auroras. They are intended to be functional. However, with the way the pieces are molded, I am never able to get them installed to the hinges in a functional manner, and the little nubs always wear out during the installation. So on one of them, it was able to be functional, but on the other one, I just glued it in the closed state. As for the top detailing, you can see that the original periscopes were amputated, and in their place, the ECA 3D printed ones were affixed. Also, on a similar note, you see the siren right over here. The siren is the kit Aurora original, and the ECA brush guard was added over it, and it just fits absolutely perfectly. On the rear portion, you can see the other rigidity strips that I added, which are absent on the Aurora kit. Oddly enough, they are found on the Atlantis re-release, but not on the OG Aurora one. On the top portion, you can see the travel lock that has been mentioned earlier. This is a new addition to the ECA set, and it just drops directly in place. Now, if you are working on the Atlantis reissue, this is something that you are going to have to make some modifications to, not to the travel lock itself, but the Atlantis one actually has a travel lock integrally molded into the rear deck grillwork area here. So this is something that if the builder so desires can polish away and replace with the ECA counterpart. From the hull takes to the turret. And as you can see, the turret also has quite a few modifications made to it. First and foremost, you can see the cast texturing that has been added to the turret surfaces for the same reasons I've touched upon in a number of videos. Also, you can see the mantlet, the barrel, and, well, you can't see the inner rotor, but all these sections are new replacement parts from Atlantis, and I, again, want to give a shout out to them for hooking me up with the following components in order to finish the build that you see here. The Atlantis parts are a direct drop-in, I don't want to say replacement, but are a direct drop-in component for in lieu of the original Aurora parts, which again were missing on this example. On the other sections, you get to see some of the jack or track ratchet mounts, which are found on this portion here of the rear, and there's no one mounted vertically right in this section. Over here and here, you can see these two little square patches put in place. On the original turret tooling, there were these provisions carried over from the M26 Pershing, which allowed you to hook up an engine hoist here, and this is how you would actually remove the engine from the vehicle's engine bay. By the M46 came around, this little feature was dropped, but the little indentation points were still present on the turret castings, and so I just simply added them on the model here with just two little pieces of plastic strip. The tarpaulin mount was added over here on the front portion. This is nothing more than a flattened piece of floor wire, bent to shape and secured in this location. The mantlet already has the tarpaulin mounts molded in, so I just need to add the second one in order to flesh it out further. Back on the mantlet section, you can see that I went ahead and drilled out the provisions for the coax as well as the optic, and I also drilled out the main 90mm. On this area over here, you get to see the really interesting Korean War pattern of combination unit, which consists of a guard for the gunner's periscope, which, by the way, the detailing is right there underneath. We have the guard, and the guard acts as double duty, where it not only secures on the vane sight, which is right over there, and again, it's really amazing what you could get in 3D prints these days, but you also had a pintle mount located right here on the front, so you could have the 50 cal mounted in this section if desired. Moving back, you can see the cupola. This too has had some minor revisions made. The hatch was not able to be salvaged to functional, just like I mentioned before with the bow ones, but I went ahead and did improve the detailing on it. The original molded in handle was amputated and a new wire one was fastened in place. I gave a basic little piece of strip plastic here to simulate the periscope that's found on the top portion of the cupola. It's a bit rudimentary, but for the topic here, it definitely will do the job just fine. On the cupola itself, I drilled out with a pin vise the little indentations, which on the real unit are large flathead screws that actually secure the cupola in place, and the addition of these little divots over here do a good job with mimicking that. Directly next to that, we have the 50 cal travel lock, right over there. It's in the folded state, of course. We have the various, or I should say, we have a replacement optic periscope right over here. The original one was blended over, and this new one was dropped in place. We also have the antenna base, which on this one here is the MP65, and as you can see, they look excellent. They're going to look even better once fully painted. On the rear bin here, we have the 50 cal storage equipment, such as the rear pintle itself, and the barrel storage mounts, along with these barrel clips, which are pretty hard to get on screen, but rest assured, the detailing is there. And we also have the receiver clamp located right over here. On the top portion, we have the pintle mount, which if I pull off the M2, you can see what it looks like. And you also have a new addition that I'm going to be adding to the set, which is a replacement loader's hatch. The loader's hatch, I actually did have the original ones that were supplied with this kit. However, in my opinion, it's one of the weaker aspects found on the model. The piece has this convex shape to it and no other details found on it. And although I utilized it in the other build, it was after that build I gave this piece of some second thought. I'm like, you know what? This does leave some room for improvement, and it would actually improve the model quite a bit if I just straight up replace it. So what I went ahead and did was, since I already built a CAD file for the oval loader's hatch found on Sherman's, and most notably this made from the same CAD files that my 1/6 scale sets, I took that exact same mechanism, namely the handle, or not the handle per se, but the hinge mechanism and the hinge mounts. I went ahead and took that and made a brand new oval that was the exact same proportions of the ones found on the Aurora. Then went ahead and did some math, and I was able to shrink everything down to the way you see it here. So the new replacement hatch is fully detailed and drops directly into place. What you will be losing is the functionality of the hatch, but again, since the original hatch is just so poorly rendered anyway, you're not really losing much for replacing that, functionality feature. The new hatch has all of the detailing molded in, which includes the hinge, the weld bead detailing, and also, most importantly, the spring and spring mounts. All of these details are integrally printed on as one unit. The only thing that is not present is the handle, but the indentations are present, so that with a pin vise, you just drill these two sections out, and you bend a new one out of floor wire like I did here, mounting it in place, thus completing the look. In order to secure this to the vehicle, you just simply snip away the molded on hinges that are found on the turret roof molding, and then once removed, this unit can be dropped directly into place. It fits on absolutely perfectly and is a direct replacement for the stock original Aurora hatch. And even already at this point, you can see just how much more improved and fleshed out the model is with this new hatch compared to the older one that I mentioned before. As for the 50, as I may have mentioned, this one here is a aftermarket replacement from shapeways.com. I do not produce these units, but they are extremely recommended. They are excellently detailed, and you'll see it in much better light once everything is fully painted. The 50 goes right into this section over here. Or I should say the M2 on the M23 cradle mount goes into this section over here. I have to mention that because of some individual out there says I shouldn't be referring to it as its proper name, but he's an idiot, so whatever. Yeah, the M2 HB on the M23 cradle gets fitted into the section, and before everything is painted, you can see just how it just drops right in. The unit can also be mounted here on the front like I originally intended, but you'll see that in order to do that, you are going to have to add some kind of a spacer on this section over here in order for the piece to fit on and fit on nice and snug. Obviously, this is something that could easily be done, but this is at the discretion of the builder. Me personally, I like mounting my 50s on the back. It just looks more proper to me as just an American tank goes, but this is something that I'll play around with as the model goes into paint, or maybe if I do another one, or when I do another Patton, I may just mount it in this section over here, just add a little bit more differentiation to my collection. Regardless, so that's really all there is to that. So at this point here, the model is fully ready to head off into paint, which is going to first head off and get a thorough coat of flat black primer. After that, it goes through the typical ECA paint work. With the model fully completed, let's go over some of the outer details, starting with, as I usually do, the suspension. As I touched upon before, some of the suspension parts are stock, original, and some of them are resin copies because, again, I didn't have enough components on hand to flesh out the model. Now that everything is painted and weathered, the two parts look absolutely identical to one another, and I couldn't even tell you which ones are the original and which ones are the resin copies. The installation and assembly is all stock with the Aurora, which means the entire suspension is rotatable. The model does have some playability to it. I'm not going to go ahead and mess with that on the table because I don't want to chip the paint off the tracks, but rest assured, if this thing wanted to push, it could. This is one aspect of the Atlantis reissues that is really great, is because they do have some playability in them, and that's what makes them really nice for youth builders. The one other thing I want to mention while we're on the topic of Atlantis is with the tracks. Like I mentioned before, the tracks on this one are the Atlantis reissues, and they are a dead ringer for the originals. In fact, like I mentioned before, they're better because of the softer, flexible material that these are molded in as opposed to the original Aurora ones. One thing about the tracks, though, that I do want to mention is that on the Atlantis ones, there is some flash found on some of the end areas. This probably has to do with the way they are molded. Fortunately, the flash is not a big deal at all, and it's something that cleans up very easily with a pair of clean cut snips and an X-Acto. After a minute or two of some careful nipping and tucking, I was able to get the track refined to the point that you see it here. Because this is an American vehicle representing a metal chevron type track, I went ahead and painted in the same exact ways as I always paint my tracks on my other vehicles of a similar type. The outer pads would have been steel and the intersections would be rubber. This is something that was carried over into this model and was painted in the exact same way. If you're painting these tracks, keep in mind that you don't want to add too much rust on the surface. These tracks really didn't rust all that often, specifically with the usage in field, but if you want to add some for contrast, that's perfectly fine. Lightly do it on the outer areas. However, the intersections where the wheels run are always rubber clad, and you want to paint them and weather them accordingly. If you do that, your model's definitely improved, and it tends to look a lot better if you just overspray everything with the same color paint. While on topic of talking about things that are rubber clad, of course, American tanks, we love our rubber tires, and each and every one of these wheels over here have the tire sections painted with Tamiya rubber black for a reason that should be fairly obvious. Another thing that should be fairly obvious jumping out at you is the fact that I went ahead and amputated the molded in side skirts that are found on the model. The Aurora kit, and same is true for the Atlantis, they have the side skirts molded on. This is something that I was never a fan of on American tanks, be it the Sherman, the Lee, the Patton. The side skirts they just don't look good on an American tank, and so they're usually the first things that I pitch. On this one here, they remove with a dremel with a high-speed removal bit, and they remove very quickly and very effortlessly. Once removed, you really get the nicer look of the suspension that you can see right here. Moving to the back, like I mentioned before, there was a bit of seam removal work going on in this section. Now that everything is fully painted and weathered, you can see the final end result, which is a, well, seamless appearance. Just a little bit of elbow grease will do you a long way, and once it's done, the model will look better afterwards. Jumping over to the front of the model, you get to see the cast texturing now in full view, and as I always mention, it's a great way to enhance just about any build is when you add the cast texturing to the appropriate locations. For a Patton or a Pershing-based vehicle, basically the whole front end would have been casted in this type of format. Also on this section over here, you get to appreciate the extra added details, such as the tool rack, dead center, the brush guards along with their headlights, the drilled out 1919, as well as also the brush guarded siren. The 3D printed parts paint very well, and once everything is painted and weathered, they just blend in with the remainder of the details without any problems. On a similar note, this brings us to the top tin work details where you get to see those rigidity bosses that I touched upon before, the cut line for the tin work, and also the rigidity brace. These obviously really improve the look of the model and really do enhance it compared to its original configuration, just like the other supports that I touched upon before, which were fabricated out of strips of plastic. Here we have those bent metal handles in full focus. Again, just extra ways to improve the model. You can see the ECA periscopes. And on the back, the best part, of course, in my opinion, on the M46 are the muffler heat shields. The ECA ones do the part absolutely perfectly and really improve the model compared to just leaving them absent. And again, we have the new addition here of the ECA travel lock. Just fully fleshes out the rear portion of the model all that much more. Moving upward brings us to the turret. Here you can see the 50 cal storage equipment, like I mentioned before. The MP65 antenna bases, and of course, like I always mention on these, the bottom portion is ceramic, while the top portion is actually a flexible rubber type material. So when you're painting them, be sure to paint them in the appropriate manner. The bottom portion, which is ceramic, I always like to use Tamiya Hull Red. It's a dead ringer for that red porcelain glazed material that are found on the real examples. And then once the Hull Red dries, a little swipe of just Tamiya gloss lacquer or any type of a gloss type clear is what's required in order to get that nice ceramic sheen like you see on my builds. Back to the sides, you really get to appreciate that cast texturing that I mentioned before, and it's amazing what this does to improve the model compared to leaving it stock. We have here the track wrench sections. Again, just a nice little bit of detailing. Even though the wrench itself or the ratchet itself is not present, the mounts do give a lot of added detailing along with those hoist sections that I mentioned earlier, and also, yes, the spare track, even though the spare track is much more simplified and rudimentary compared to what it's supposed to be. Again, it just adds just the right amount of detail to the side of the turret over here. The opposite side of the turret is pretty plain. We have another ratchet section in this area over here. And one thing that I did not mention is that I didn't fabricate the foul weather driving hood rack, which are found on some examples of the M46. This is a type of detailing that is more or less seen on the M26 Pershing and the T26E3. However, on the M46, it was optional, as there are lots of examples of this pattern of vehicle with or without them. So for this one here, I saved a little bit of time and just omitted it on this particular example. Moving to the turret roof takes us to the combination brush guard, vane sight, and front mounted 50 cal pintle mount. It's a nice little chunk of detailing over there, and it really does make the model look all that much more improved compared to the stock original. We have that other periscope, cupola, folding travel lock, as well as the loader's hatch. And now that it's fully painted and weathered, you can see how all those spring details just jump right out. And again, it just really improves this model compared to the original 1950s design that it originally had. The pintle mount is another bit of detailing that really greatly improves the look of the build, as is the aftermarket M2HB on the M23 cradle mount that you can see right here. When you're painting these units, as I often mention, a common mistake that I see on a lot of builds out there, mostly novice builds, is that they paint the entire thing flat black and they weather it or don't weather it at all. If you're working on one of these models, be sure to remember that the cradle mount is olive drab. It's not flat black or gunmetal or whatever. It's just olive drab or olive green, depending on, you know, the era that you're building your vehicle in. The cradle includes the bottom portion here that the receiver plugs into, the yoke, and the ammo can holder. All of these details are very nicely rendered on this example here, and I can't stress this enough. This is probably the best Browning M2HB with the M23 cradle setup that I've seen in any set in 1/48 scale. If you're working on any 1/48 scale tank, be it a Tamiya Sherman, or an old Bandai, whatever, the addition of this 50 here is just awesome. It is a great piece of kit. Can't recommend it enough. The trick is with, of course, the paintwork. All the details are there. You just have to carefully paint them. You do that, the thing will look like $1,000,000. So in addition to painting the cradle, which again includes the ammo can holder as well as the belt tensioner right there, you also want to be sure to paint the ammo can. The ammo can be a different color of olive drab compared to the remainder of the cradle, and this is a technique that I strongly recommend because this gives a visual change up in the color and it makes it look like it's just more contrast. And again, something like this would of course be seen on real vehicles. The ammo can has its World War II pattern where it has the front hinging lid, which you can see right here. It's in the open position. And we also have the exposed ammo belt, which again is so nicely rendered. The ammo belt, again, it's another thing that a lot of people out there mistakenly paint wrong. Either they just are unaware or just didn't think about painting it properly. To paint an ammo belt in 1/35 scale or 1/48 scale in this manner, doesn't matter, it's the same technique. Keep in mind the rear section of the ammunition is brass. It's just, you know, brass case ammo. The color is just a swipe of just gold spray paint or some kind of other gold paint. The projectiles are full metal jackets and they're copper, and just a little swipe of Tesser's copper will do the job. The thing that most people tend to mess up is the color of the belt. Either they forget it altogether or they just don't realize the color. The belt is just flat black. So just a little swipe of flat black in a nice little line over here will give you the detailing of the painted ammo belt. Of course, the belts on these units over here are disintegrating link, and they would be these black metallic things. Once you go ahead and paint it like the way I just mentioned, the model's accuracy just jumps up tenfold. In addition to that, another thing that I always mention is to paint your grips on your Brownings. A lot of people make this mistake. The two spade grips in the back as well as the charging handle are either wood or they're a Bakelite material. Again, as I often mention, for my models, I like to roll with the Bakelite type material because it was really, really common, and it's also easier to make something look like Bakelite as opposed to trying to replicate wood. So for this, I just used the whole red color like I touched upon before for the antenna bases, and it does a really good job at mimicking the color of the red Bakelite. You can also achieve a similar effect with painting the handles gloss black because there was also black Bakelite as well. As for which one to use, it's your personal preference. Mine, I prefer the red. You can even mix and match it where you have the spades one color and the charging handle a different one. That's another option that you can do. Again, it will be a way to add just a little bit more contrast to your build. One other thing that I want to mention on this M2 is that I add a little poof here of flat black on the muzzle just to give you a little bit of powder fouling, which is something that I also did on the coax as well as the main 90mm. So on the mantlet itself, like I mentioned before, this was casted, and with everything painted, you can see how that cast section just improves the build overall. As well as I mentioned before about drilling out the sections of the coax, which is right over here, as well as the optic. One thing about the M46 is that there is a tube that was welded in this section over here that was done in order to, I guess, prevent or reduce the amount of glare that was going into this section. And I believe this was also done in a way to aid with the tarpaulin when it gets clipped in place. It's either one of the two, or I think it was actually both, if I'm not mistaken. On the main 90mm, this is the Atlantis version, which again is nothing more than a carbon copy of the original Aurora tooling, and it just blends in absolutely swimmingly. The muzzle brake on the end, I actually really dug the version on the Aurora one. They were on the right path. They did the bore evacuator. It is appropriately detailed, and it looks pretty good, I find, as well as the shape here of the cut-down muzzle brake. They even have the little baffles, which would have been found on this portion here on the front. And this is something that I did not add and was integrally just molded on. The only addition I did was drill this section out like I referenced earlier. You do that, the piece looks so much more improved overall. And that's all there is for the detailing, and this leads us to the paint and the markings. Obviously, the model's paintwork is that of a Korean War Tiger Face M46 Patton tank, which is always one of my personal favorites. And for the application, this was done much along similar lines as the Dragon 135th scale M46 Patton that I recently did a video on. This one, though, where the difference is with the types of paint and the colors that were used. For the base coat, I went with my dark post-World War II shade of olive drab. I've utilized this paint on a number of other builds in the past, and it's one that I always find looks really good specifically for late World War II and 1950s era US armor. Where things are a little bit differently on this build compared to the other one is with, well, the shade, again, is totally different. I use a slightly different green that I developed. And also the yellow. The yellow on this one over here is from a new vendor that I never used before, but was one that I always seen referenced in a lot of other YouTube videos, as well as also in some Facebook groups that I frequent, and that is from Mission Models. After seeing this paint referenced online several times, I always had a curiosity about it and always wanted to give it a try. So, imagine my surprise when one day I'm perusing my local hobby shop and they set up a kiosk full of these new paints, and they instantly had my attention. One thing that I instantly noticed about the Mission paints, and it's one thing that I'm really grateful for, is that they are a fantastic replacement for Model Master. Model Master had a lot of really niche specialty colors that were only produced by them and were the type of things that you would use in certain applications, and you were glad to have them when those certain applications arose. Well, when they went belly up, or I should say when they pulled the plug on their modeling paints, this obviously left quite a bit of a hole in the industry, and I'm glad that Mission Models stepped up to the plate in order to fill out the hole that was left with Model Master's departure. Unlike Model Master, where Model Master paints were enamel-based, these ones here are acrylic-based, which is great because acrylic paints are awesome to work with, and, you know, I utilize them all the time. So if you are used to working with enamels, this is a bit of a departure compared to the Model Master counterpart. However, you can still adapt relatively easily. As for the paint themselves, the consistency is excellent for airbrushing as well as paintbrushing as well. I'll circle back on that on a future video set that I'm finishing off right now. But for this particular model, I went ahead and masked up certain areas just to prevent sort of overspray, and the yellow was applied via the airbrush. The airbrush application was excellent. The paint goes on without any sort of problems, which, by the way, for yellow, that's an achievement because yellow is always one of those colors that has a pain in the ass to work with, and the Mission Models paint went on without any problems. It just went straight from the bottle into the paint cup. I don't even think I needed to dilute it or anything. It was ready to go from the get-go. Excellent quality paint. However, there is a caveat to this paint, and this is something that I want to mention because if you're a novice out there, or if you don't have some certain tools or skill sets in line, this paint here is definitely not going to be recommended for you. What I'm referring to is not with the paint quality or with the application or even the adherence. All of those are excellent. The problem is with once the paint is drying on the surface, you have to seal it. The paint is very, 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 very susceptible to moisture. I'm talking about where if you have a drop of water land on the surface, the paint will just dissolve and wash away. This is extremely relevant, specifically if you're going to apply decals and water slide decals to your model. A lot of individuals out there, again, namely more or less novices, when they're building a model, they don't know of things like varnish or other type of sealers. So they basically take their plastic model, they paint it, and then once the paint is done, they'll weather it, throw on some markings, and call it a day. In fact, that was kind of how I was doing it for a while, although I would still add a little bit of dull coat on the decals to seal it to the surface. But if you're the type of person that does not use varnishes, you're going to be in for a bad time because the paint is highly, highly water soluble to the point where if you are applying your water slide decal, you add a little drop of water on the model and you slide it off, the thing is going to run and become a mess really, really quick on you, and your finish is going to be ruined. So this is something that you got to keep in mind. On the model over here, basically, once the yellow was applied, I went ahead and completed the remainder of the paintwork, namely the tiger stripes and all that, which is, again, done with the paintbrush. And then once all of the paintwork was concluded, I went ahead and varnished the entire model with the VMS matte varnish. Once the matte varnish is added, at that point there, the model surface becomes safe with handling with moisture. That is when you can apply the markings, decals, and what have you on your model painted with Mission Models paints. However, if you don't have varnish or you don't have varnish skill sets, don't use this paint. Stay clear of it. Stick with some other brand like Tamiya or Vallejo or something along those lines. The Mission ones here are really more or less next level type paint, and you need to have varnish in order to just complete the model. On a similar note, on this model here, like I said before, I was painting all of the tiger stripes. This was something you also have to be careful for because, again, I'm using latex for the white as well as, to me, a flat black for the stripes. These are water-soluble paints, and when I was applying them, you got to make sure you got to do it in a careful manner because if the consistency isn't right, it's going to cause a bit of a problem with the paint that's already adhered on the surface. So again, you got to use certain type of skill sets when working with these paints. I will say though that if you have your skill sets in line, these paints here are awesome. I absolutely love these paints. They work great. And I do have a bunch of models in the lineup that I use these paints on, and I am just blown away with the quality. They are excellent. Absolutely worth the money, with the caveat that you have the skill sets. So aside from the yellow, the remainder of the tiger face was all done via paintbrush. This entire model here is all hand painted. The teeth, the claws, the eyes, the eyebrows, the whiskers, all of that was hand painted. I had several images of the real M46 Pattons with this type of artwork on them, so I used that as a reference point in order to apply the markings that you see here. Luckily, there's a lot of artistic licensing with these vehicles since they were all done in field by just random people, and so there are lots of different variations of the type of paintwork that you can do on them, which is great because it helps you make it more of your own, and you can go ahead and have your model with its own type of characteristics to it, and you'll be more than accurate for the build at hand. After the face work was all done, the model was then weathered, and I weathered it with the same type of techniques that I've touched upon in a number of my other videos. This would include washes, double toning, as well as dry brushing. The washes and double toning were done via the airbrush, while the dry brushing was, well, done with a paintbrush. The Two things I want to mention, circling back to the Mission Models paint, is that this model here, I do utilize Tamiya panel line accent color in order to highlight some of the edging and other things along those lines. And this is done, of course, via the paintbrush. And one thing I want to mention is that, like I touched upon before, the paint is extremely water soluble. However, you don't have that problem with the panel line accent because that is an enamel-based solution and it utilizes paint thinner. And you can add the paint into those locations and the Mission model paint will not have any problems with dissolving or anything along those lines. Same is also true for the airbrush. I airbrush with acrylics that are watered down with just tap water, and if the consistency is just right, you can apply it carefully to certain locations and you're not going to have to worry about the paint getting too loose on you. Where things become a problem is if you're doing a wash with acrylics and you're using water as a soluble or even alcohol as a soluble. If you just, spray the entire model to where it's dripping, then that's where you're going to have a problem where the paint's going to dissolve on you. So that's something that you want to avoid. However, if the paint is somewhat on the lighter end, in that it's not heavily watered down, and if you have your PSI just right, you can apply it to certain locations and areas, and the paint will not have any problems on you. Obviously, once all of the paintwork was done, like I touched upon before, the entire model was covered in VMS matte varnish via the airbrush, and this was done again to thoroughly seal the Mission Models paint, but also to give the model the wonderful look that you see here. And as I touched upon before, the VMS matte varnish is awesome. I literally cannot recommend that stuff enough. And he listened to my emails. He offers the stuff now in larger volume bottles. So thank you if you're watching this. I love the bigger bottles. I've bought several of them. And yeah, if you build a lot of models like I do, the bigger volume ones are definitely coming in handy. As for actual markings, you'll notice that there are no markings on this model here. I didn't have any decals that were small enough that would have worked for this build, but also these Korean War tanks didn't really have many markings on them per se. Some of them had numbers, some of them had a star here or there, but again, this opens up to artistic licensing, and if you go with a tiger face like this, you could forego the markings and still be okay. And that's all there really is to mention about the build and the paintwork itself. So let's go ahead and take the opportunity to bring onto the table the Atlantis reissue of the Aurora M46 kit. This model here has its own dedicated model showcase or Aurora Park video, and of course that can be found on the channel. But here you get to see the two builds side by side. Obviously they have both been upgraded with the ECA detail components. However, this one here features some differences compared to the one on the Atlantis, like I've already mentioned before. However, one thing I do want to mention is that this is not the first time that I worked on an Aurora M46 Patton kit. In fact, I built one many years ago, about 20 to be exact, and that kit can be seen right here. This model here is an original Aurora M46 Patton. As I touched upon before, when I purchased the lot of Aurora kits, I had several of them that were in pretty decent condition and were pretty much almost ready for painting. This one here was one that fell into that category. The model was built back in 2002, and I basically detailed it to the configuration that you see here. I went ahead and scratch built a number of detail components for the same reasons that I needed to tool up the ones that are on these two examples over here. However, with the scale that I was working in and also with my level of scratch building at the time, what you see here was really the best I was able to accomplish for that era. And I gotta say, I did a pretty decent job overall. It's funny because when I was starting on this one over here, designing all the detailed parts for it, I just basically picked up where I left off on this particular example. When it comes to paintwork, well, obviously you can see a trend here. I always did love the Korean War tiger face painted tanks. And this one here is nothing more than utilizing techniques that I first pioneered back during this period. And these two models here are painted basically identically with the same type of techniques, being the use of the airbrush as well as also with the paintbrushing for certain features on the tiger face. It's a little bit more simpler compared to the newer version, but, you could definitely see it both came from the same artist. It's also interesting to mention that this piece is casted with the same type of casting techniques that were, you guessed it, utilized on these two examples. Only on these two, I went ahead and casted the model further by adding the texturing to the front hull section, while on this one here, the casting is only found on the mantlet area, but the casting detailing is there nonetheless. As I rotate the model around, you can still see exactly where my mind was at the time and how it evolved into my future builds. For instance, on the rear section, I went ahead and drilled out the exhaust manifolds, and I also utilized the exact same technique for the rigidity turnbuckles with the use of floor wire. What is missing are the heat shields found on the exhaust manifolds. This was something I wasn't really able to fabricate back then, but you know what? I actually do have a spare set of printed ones on hand. Perhaps I might go ahead, paint them up with the same type of paints and weather them with the same older techniques, and then drop them on here just to finally get this one, you know, just that much more polished off. And I might as well throw an M2 HB on the piddle mount, again, further completing it, but I'm digressing. One other thing I want to mention is that you can see I went ahead and added the storage equipment here for the 50 cal, as well as the storage pintle, although it's just a nail, but again, you know, it's detailing nonetheless. Even the grab handles here are done in the exact same manner as they were done on the other example that I mentioned before. The more things change, the more things stay the same. While we're on the topic of cameos, screw it, I might as well go ahead and bring out my other M46 Patton that's in my collection, and that is the vintage 1/35th scale Dragon M46 Patton kit. This model here is actually an excellent kit and can be found in its own model showcase video that's listed on the ECA channel. I recommend checking that out if not only you're a fan of the M46 Patton, but if you also really enjoy Korean War era tank models as well. These two models are indeed brothers because I did work on them basically at the same time. This one here was actually the source where I took the Travelock and was able to shrink that down and miniaturize it to 1/48 scale, which is the one that I mentioned before and it's now found on the ECA sets. The two models, although they were built at roughly the same time, I did go ahead and experiment a little bit with the paint work where you can see, or hopefully you can see, that the paint is different on the two examples. This one here has more of a green type olive drab, while this one here it's more of a darker, richer olive drab. Both colors, by the way, are perfectly appropriate for the Korean War pattern. And for the yellow used on the tiger face, this one here I used Tamiya, this one here I used Mission, as I touched upon before. As I often mention in my videos, it's good to have models painted, even if it's the same type of build, but painted slightly differently from one another, because this is a way to break monotony and to add a little bit more variation and uniqueness to your collection, as opposed to having everything painted the same, which you'll end up with a collection that's mostly myopic. Needless to say, at the end of the project, I couldn't be any happier in how this one turned out. This was one of those models that's been sitting in the shop now for far too long, so finally getting to it and building up feels great, but also building up to the condition that we have here really does make it feel all that much more better. This is the type of project where, yeah, I could have built it a number of years ago, but I'm kind of glad that I finally got to it at this point because now I have all of the extra accessories in both the Atlantis re-release parts, but also with the 3D printed accessories that just didn't exist a number of years ago. It is without these components over here where it would have been almost impossible to bring the model up to the condition that we have right here. So with all that factored in, I'm definitely happy that things turned out the way they did. Normally at this point in the video, this would pivot us into skill level recommendation, and although I can still do that with this one here, really this would be just retreading old ground because I already went through all of this information in much more greater length and detail in the Atlantis reissue Aurora Park video that I've already referenced several times in this video alone. And all of that information is just as relevant for this one over here, with the caveat that this one here does not have the availability and cost that is a benefit on the Atlantis. These ones over here are a vintage kit, so you are going to be finding them secondhand, and chances are good you could find them in a multitude of different configurations, from virgin in the box and untouched, to like this one over here where it was basically just in shambles, and basically everywhere else in between. The Atlantis kits, because they are new production, they are ridiculously easy to find and are also much more affordable compared to the original Aurora one. The Auroras are a little bit more expensive. They're not nearly as expensive as they were, like when I was a kid 15, 20 some odd years ago. The prices on these have really dropped in the years that came after. However, they are still going to be more expensive generally compared to the Atlantis re-release. And considering what the kit does give you and build into, this may or may not be deemed worth it by the builder in the end. Really, the only reason why you would seek out specifically the Aurora version of this kit as opposed to the Atlantis reissue is purely for collectability and for nostalgia reasons. And what I'm referring to is someone who built the Atlantis reissue and they really enjoyed the experience and they walked away with saying to themselves, wow, that was actually really cool. I want to see if I could, find some more of these. Well, if that's you, congratulations, you stumbled into the wonderful world of vintage model kit collecting. And if that's you, the Aurora kits here are a great avenue to look into. Like I stated before, just box art alone, there are so many different variations of the box art, and if you're the type of person that likes to collect things, well, there's quite a few options that are available. As for another reason why you would seek out the Aurora version specifically is, well, there's something about having an original item as opposed to a reissue. It is a bit of a placebo effect, admittedly. However, there are differences between the tooling compared between the original Aurora and the Atlantis reissue, and as a matter of fact, I go over that in the Atlantis video. And if you're the type of person that's a completist, well, you can easily go ahead and scratch that itch by not only having the Atlantis reissue, but also seeking out several of the original Aurora ones that are still floating around out there on the market. And just like with the Atlantis reissue, the Aurora kits here are a fun platform to work on, and it's really fun to take one of these older kits and to see exactly how far you can carry it with adding on extra details compared to the way the kit was originally developed all of those decades ago. And as you can see, by the addition of some detail accessories as well as some other more modern modeling techniques, you can really polish up one of these old kits into something that's pretty unique. Another great benefit of this particular Aurora kit is the fact that Atlantis does exist. Like I mentioned before, originally this kit here would have never been able to have been built because I was missing some key pieces of detailing, namely the tracks, the mantlet, and the barrel. Well, in the past, this would have been almost impossible to go ahead and correct, but thanks to Atlantis, I was able to contact them and acquire the missing components in order to finalize and build the model that we have here. Again, I want to give them a shout out because if it wasn't for their assistance and great help, I would have never been able to build the model that you see in front of you. And Atlantis does have a section on their website where you can contact them and you can tell them the kit that you have, the parts that you're missing, and if it's something that they have components for or the molds for, they will definitely be able to hook you up with some proper drop-in replacements. I cannot recommend their service enough. One thing that I do want to add, and it's something that I mentioned in the Atlantis video, and it's one that I find to be pretty comical, is that this model here, for as old as it is still just as relevant today in the year 2023 when I'm filming this, as it was in the mid-1950s when it was originally designed and released. And that's because this is still the only option out there for a 1/48 scale M46 Patton. If you're working on a diorama in 1/48 scale, or you're just a 1/48 scale tank collector and you want to have an M46 in your collection for one reason or another, you're looking at it. This is it. At the moment, there are no other contenders for a 1/48 scale M46 Patton. So if that's you, congratulations, you just found your kit to add to your collection. And with that, that wraps up this episode of Aurora Park. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe to this channel where it's a great way to keep up to date on new posted content, being other episodes of Aurora Park, my smaller scale model showcase videos, and my larger scale project update videos that frequently get posted to this channel. Another way to keep in loop of new posted content is by liking us on Facebook. There I have more photographs of this particular build, as well as the other smaller and larger scale builds that I've mentioned before on this channel. Furthermore, don't forget to swing by eastcoastarmory.com for more 1/6 and 1/16 scale builds and detail components, as well as don't forget to swing by the ECA Shapeway store, where you get to find the 3D printed details like the ones that were used on this particular model, as well as several of the other details that I've released over the years. And with that, I'll see you all on the next one. Take care.